Okay. Hey ladies and gentlemen, this is Miss Humbert and we're going to do our last notes of Unit 4, which is Unit 4 Learning Target 9 notes. So we're going to talk about what happens when we get a double root. So basically all we're doing today is the same thing with the x, except this time we're talking about what happens when our factors are the same. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. So what do you do with a double root? Well, a double root is when you factor the trinomial and you have two of the same factors. Then what we're going to do is we're going to write that as one factor or one binomial squared. So let's move forward and let's take a look at what some of these examples are going to look like. So taking a look at number 1. So for number 1, we want to set up our x. So we're going to multiply our a times our c, and that's going to give us 25. And then we're going to be adding to 10. So what multiplies to 25 and adds to 10? Well, that's going to be 5 and 5. So now I'm going to rewrite out this equation splitting up that middle term. So I'm going to split up 10x, and instead of 10x, I'm going to have 5x and 5x. And now I'm ready to factor this by grouping. So I'm going to make my two groups. Between x squared and 5x, I can divide out an x. So I'm taking and dividing each term by x. X squared divided by x is just x. 5x over x cancels, and I'm left with 5. Between 5x and 25, you can divide out a 5. So I'm taking and I'm dividing each of these terms then by 5. 5x divided by 5, I'm just left with x, and 25 divided by 5, I'm left with 5. So x plus 5 and x plus 5, those are my leftovers, and they're matching, so I'm going to factor those out. And once I've factored those out, I'm going to write what's left after that. Well, again, I'm going to get x plus 5. So what I notice here is this factor is the same as this factor. So since the two factors are the same, I'm going to write them as one factor and then square it. So this right here is my final answer. It's more simplified when we write it like that as opposed to the two factors next to each other being multiplied. So let's take a look at number 2. So for number 2, we want to multiply to 49 and add to a negative 14. Well, here I say I'm multiplying to a positive product. That means my signs need to be the same. Well, since my sum is negative, they're both going to be negative. So to multiply to a positive 49 and a negative 14, I'm going to use negative 7 and 7, negative 7. So now I'm going to keep it, and so I'm going to keep this middle, the first term the same, and then I'm going to split that middle term as 7x and 7x. So this right here is still 14. I'm just going to be splitting it up. And then again, my last term stays the same. So now I'm ready to factor by grouping. So I'm going to make my two groups. Between x squared and 7x, I can divide out an x. So I'm taking and dividing each of these terms by x. X squared divided by x is x. Negative 7x over x is negative 7. Here I notice there's a negative sign in the middle, so I'm taking out a negative greatest common factor. And then I'm going to take out a negative 7. So I'm taking and dividing each of these by negative 7. And then I'm left with x minus 7. So here my leftovers are matching, so I can factor those out. And once I've factored those out, I'm going to write what's left after that, which is x minus 7. So here normally would be our answer, but then I notice that those two factors are the same. So I'm going to write them as one binomial squared. So this right here is your final answer for number 2. Let's take a look at number 3. So for number 3, remember when you're setting this up, you need to take your a and multiply it by your c. That's what gives you that top term. So here you're multiplying to 4 and adding to 4. Well, what multiplies to 4 and adds to 4? Well, that's going to be 2 and 2. So now I'm ready to set this up to factor by grouping. So I'm going to take and I'm going to split that middle term up. So I'm going to keep 4x squared the same, and then I'm going to write this as 2x plus 2x. So this is really still 4x, but I'm just splitting up that middle term. And now I'm ready to factor by grouping. So I'm going to make my two groups. Between 4 and 2, I can divide out a 2 and an x. So I'm taking and dividing each of these terms by 2x. Then here I'm left with 2x plus 1 when you divide all of that out. Between 2x and 1, you can't take anything out, so I'm just going to take out a 1 here as a placeholder, so I remember that there's a 1 involved. So now I notice that my leftovers are matching, so I can go ahead and factor those out. And once I've gotten rid of those, I'm going to go ahead and write what's left over. So I have 2x plus 1 times 2x plus 1. Now I'm going to write that as 2x plus 1 and then quantity squared. So I'm going to write it as one binomial being squared. Well, let's take a look at number 42. Now, it doesn't always happen, obviously, that it works out to be the same factor twice. Okay, so then we don't need to worry about putting it written as one factor squared. So here we're multiplying to a negative 42 and adding to a negative 1. Well, what multiplies to a negative 42 and adds to a negative 1? That's going to be negative 7 and positive 6. So now I'm ready to set this up to factor by grouping. Keep my first term the same, then I'm going to be putting an x with each of those, and I'm splitting up negative 1x as negative 7x plus 6x. And now once I have 4 terms, I'm ready to factor by grouping. So I'm going to make my 2 groups. Between x squared and 7x, I can take out an x, and I'm left with x minus 7. Between 6 and 42, I can take out a 6. When I divide each of those terms, I get x minus 7. I'm sorry, this should be a minus 7 from our sign above. So I notice that my leftovers are matching, so I can factor out an x minus 7. Once I factor out x minus 7, I'm going to write what's left after that, which is x plus 6. So then I get x minus 7 and x plus 6 for my final answer for number 4. Let's take a look at number 5. So for number 5, we're going to set up our x. So to set up our x, we're going to multiply our first and our last terms. Well, 2 times 7 is going to give me 14. So we're multiplying to 14 and adding to 9. So that's going to be 7 and 2. So now what we're going to do is we're going to keep our first term the same. Then instead of writing 9x, I'm going to split it up using this. So this is 7x plus 2x. And now I'm ready to factor by grouping. So I'm going to make my 2 groups. Between 2x squared and x, I can divide out an x. So I'm dividing each of these terms by x. And then I'm left with 2x plus 7. Out of the second group, I'm going to factor out a 1. And then I'm left with 2x plus 7. So again, you notice that the leftovers are matching, so I can factor those out. Once I get rid of those leftovers, I'm going to write what's left after that, which is x plus 1. So this right here represents your final answer for number 5. Let's take a look at number 6. So for number 6, we're going to be multiplying to a positive 3 and adding to a negative 4. Positive product means both our signs are the same, but we're adding to a negative 4. So that's going to be negative 1 and negative 3. So now I'm going to rewrite out this equation. I'm going to keep my first term the same, and I'm going to split up that negative 4x as negative 1x minus 3x. So again, this is the same thing as negative 4x. And now I'm ready to factor by grouping. So I'm going to make my 2 groups. Between x squared and negative 1x, I can divide out an x, so then I'm left with x minus 1. Here I notice that there's a negative sign, so I need to take out a negative GCF. So then I'm dividing each of those terms by a negative 3. And when I do that, I'm left with x minus 1. So here are our leftovers here are x minus 1. And once we cancel out our leftovers, we're going to see what's left after that, which is x minus 3. So this right here is your final answer for number 6. Let's take a look a little bit more in factoring. This has happened to us once in the past on that review sheet we did way back on before quiz 2. All right, so not every trinomial can be factored. If the x isn't solvable, if the x doesn't work, then we say that the trinomial is not factorable. Well, let's say you get the x to work and then you can't factor by grouping. Then you did something wrong. But if you can't get the x to work at all, then the trinomial is not factorable. So let's take a look at this. So we're starting to take a look, and we're going to take a look. So we're multiplying to 4 and adding to 2. Well, let's take a look at the things that multiply to 4. 1 and 4, 2 and 2. Positive product, positive sum, both my signs need to be positive. There's no way that either of those two are going to add to 2. It's just not possible. So this right here is not factorable. Next, let's take a look at number 8. So for number 8, we're multiplying to 5 and adding to 3. Well, let's take a look at what multiplies to 5. Well, that's just going to be 1 and 5. Positive product, positive sum, both my signs are positive. There's no way 1 plus 5 is going to add to 3. So that means it's not factorable. Well, now that we've learned about not factorable, it doesn't mean you can just give up and assume it's not factorable. You still need to check every single one of those factors to make sure you know that it's not factorable. Last but not least, let's take a look at this word problem. Look at the figure below. The rectangle has an area of 3x squared minus 10x minus 8 centimeters. Find the length and the width of the rectangle. So for an area of a triangle, it's going to be length times width. The area of a rectangle is length times width. Well, this, at some point, was length times width. Now we need to undo that. So it was being two binomials multiplied. So all that means is we just have to factor this. So in order to factor it, we have 3x squared minus 10x minus 8. We're going to take and we're going to multiply the first and the last term. 3 times negative 8 is negative 24, adding to negative 10. So what multiplies to a negative 24 and adds to a negative 10? Well, first of all, I'm going to negative and a positive product. I'm going to use negative 12 and positive 2. Negative 4 and negative 6 would multiply to a positive 24. So that's why I have to use negative 12 and positive 2. So now I'm going to rewrite out this equation. I'm going to keep my 3x squared the same, and then I'm going to put an x with each of those, and I'm going to split up that 10x term. And now from this point, I'm ready to factor by grouping. So I'm going to make my groups. Between 3 and 12, I can take out a 3. So I'm dividing each term by 3, and I'm left, and an x. And then I'm left with 3x on the outside. Divide everything by 3x, I'm left with x minus 4. Between 2 and 8, I can divide out a 2, and then we're left with x minus 4. So we check, our leftovers are matching, and we get x minus 4. And then we're going to write what's left after that, which is 3x plus 2. So the area, if you were to take the two sides, there was one side that was x minus 4, and there was other side that was 3x plus 2. So that concludes your note video today. Go ahead and show me your note sheet when you're done. Thanks for listening.